haven't been able to get through. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التمييز وألهمنا حسن التصور والتصديق وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Idah al-Mubham, Sharh al-Sullam in logic, we have reached lesson number 4, which is on Anwa' al-Ilm al-Hadith, on the types of originated knowledge. And here, of course, because the purpose of logic is to understand how we can understand and argue with, using the building blocks of acquired knowledge, then it was befitting to first define what is knowledge, right? And its types, right? And in the commentary here on the hashiyah that we're referring from, there's a useful definition of knowledge, right? Knowledge, al-ilm, bottom of page 117. He says that what is knowledge? He says it is حصول صورة الشيء في العقل, right? It is for the form of something to be attained in the mind, in the intellect. But of course, shay here is in the general linguistic thing of anything that can be conceived of. Because theologically, a thing is that which exists, right? Okay. And just quickly, we recap, we always begin with clarity of purpose, that there's a purpose of logic, right? Sound definitions, sound arguments, identifying unsound definitions and unsound arguments, sharpening one's reasoning and thinking, and to understand the usage, right, and method of the scholars who used this nomenclature and this method in the way they define terms, they structure their arguments, etc. So today we're going to begin by looking at Anwa' al-ilm al-hadith, right? And these are, so we start from lines 19 to 20, right? Right. So he says, so what does he say? Right. And so we'll cover in two parts, lines 19 to 25, بإذن ta'ala. So he says, right, إدراك مفرد تصورا علم ودرك نسبة بتصديق وسم وقدم الأول عند الوضع لأنه مقدم بالطبع. Right? Right? That, and we're quite deliberately avoiding, right? We are avoiding terminology here, because one of the things that happens, and Imam Ghazali makes this, that people get stuck on terms and forget meanings, right? So if you've studied logic, if you've studied philosophy, if you've done this, there are definitions there's terminology and its definitions, and that's an easy thing to get. But to conceive of it, right? He says, إدراك مفرد تصورا علم. Understanding a singular matter is called tasawwur, right? Tasawwur is to conceive of something, right? وَدَرْكُ نِسْبَةٍ بِتَصْدِيقٍ وُسِمٍ, and to come to knowledge of the occurrence of a relationship between two matters is called tasdeeq, confirmation, is named tasdeeq. قدم الأول عند الوضع, and mention the first when you put them together, because it naturally comes first. لأنه مقدم بالطبع, right? Because it naturally comes first. So tasawwur is to conceive of a singular meaning, and he'll give examples. Zayd, singular meaning, right? Chair, singular meaning, right? That is called tasawwur, right? And singular meanings are known by definitions. Say, this is a beanbag. You don't know what a beanbag is, so we define it. Definitions make singular concepts known. Whereas tasdeeq is to confirm, right? Tasdeeq is to realize the occurrence of a relationship between two matters, right? So you say, Zaydun qa'im. Zayd is standing. So you conceive. So now if you think about that and say yes, right? That confirmation arises from four matters, right? You conceive of Zayd, you conceive of standing, you conceive of that relationship between Zayd and standing, and then you confirm that relationship, or you don't confirm it. You reject it, right? So you say, for example, وَلِعَيَذُ بِاللَّهِ, right? If you say, الشريك يعني if a disbeliever were to say عياذ بالله لله شريك, Allah has a partner, right? So you define Allah. Who is, you come for a definition of God. Who is God? Right? That's first tasawwur. Secondly, what is a partner? You define. Then you think about the relationship between Allah and a partner. And then you either affirm that relationship or negate it. So these four occurring, this is tasdeeq. Idraku wuqu'i nisbah. And he'll share the definition of this. And that's all that there is to tasawwur and tasdeeq. Right? And then both tasawwur and tasdeeq can be intuitive. It's obvious. You don't need to reflect. Do you need to think about what's a chair? Right? But if we were to say Jameed, you know what Jameed is? No. But if you thought about, let's say you'd gone to Jordan once, Jameed, say, that it's that thing made from you think about it, then you come to know. Singular concept. Some people are bad with vegetable names. So what's a vegetable that you don't know? Or fruit that you get confused about, right? Like some people get confused between peaches and apricots. So let's say you're of the Ahl al-Tahayyur, those who get confused. What's a peach and what's an apricot? So I said, would you like a peach? So you think, is it the little ones or is it those big fat ones? So you think about it for a moment. That's nadari. You have to think about it. So daruri is intuitive. You don't have to think about it. Nadari, you have to think about. Right? And likewise with arguments. Right? Right? With tasdeeqat. Some things are intuitively obvious, right? That a circle is not a square. Most people don't have to sit down. Why isn't a circle a square? Is that really possible? It's just intuitively obvious because most of us can immediately think of a circle. We can think of a square. We don't need to think. 1 + 1 is 2. But a longer equation, we may need to think about it, right? For some intelligent people, for others is nadari, requires reflection, may be intuitive for them. And for some people who are slow in understanding, the intuitive may require a lot of reflection. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he has an amazing book called Al-Faqih wal-Mutafaqih. He mentions that a man came to one of the ulama after he gave a lesson, says, I didn't understand. Lam afham. So he said to him, Ama in kunta lam tafham li'annaka ma fahimt fa'ufahimuka. That if you didn't understand because you didn't reach understanding of the thing, then I'll explain it further. لكنك لو لم تفهم لأنك لن تفهم فدعني. Okay? But if you didn't understand because you won't understand, then please leave me alone. Rahimahumullah ta'ala. Right? And then, so he says in line 21, وَالنَّظَرِ مَحْتَاجَ لِلتَّأَمُّلِ. Right? وَعَكْسُهُ هُوَ الضَّرُورِيُّ الْجَلِي. So the nadari is that which requires reflection. And the opposite is the daruri, is the intuitively true. Right? Which is evident, jali. وَمَا بِهِ إِلَى تَصَوُّرٍ وُصِلْ يُدْعَى بِقَوْلٍ شَارِحٍ فَلْتَبْتَهِلْ. And that through which one reaches tasawwur, conception of an individual term, is called al-qawl al-sharih. It's a definition. It's an explanatory statement. Right? That's literally what qawlun sharih, explanatory statement, meaning a definition. Right? A defining expression, you could say. Because sharaha is to open something up. Right? Sharh al-sadr is the expansion of the heart. Right? To literally open something up. فَلْتَبْتَهِلْ. So be penitent, be devoted. وما لتصديق به توصل بالحجة يعرف عند العقلاء. And that which you come to confirm something as true is called a proof, according to those of intellect. Right? So these are lines 19 to 23. And so then the commentator explains. He says, أقول لفظ أنواع مخرج للعلم القديم. When he says the types of originated knowledge in the title, this excludes eternal knowledge, right? Because in eternity, and we're talking about absolute eternity, right? Absolute eternity is beyond time and beyond being made up of parts, right? So divine, not in eternity, there is the knowledge of God, and the knowledge of God is in absolute eternity. So Allah is characterized by absolute eternity. His attributes, including knowledge, is characterized by absolute eternity. Therefore, Allah's knowledge is not made up of parts. His knowledge relates to knowables beyond enumeration. Allah's knowledge encompasses all the necessary, all the possible, and all the absurd. But His knowledge is not made up of parts. It's absolute oneness. Allah is absolutely one in His entity, His attributes, and His actions. Right? So because of that, his mentioning types in the title, Anwa'ul Ilm, excludes eternal knowledge. فإنه لا تنوع فيه أي في العلم القديم, because there are no parts in eternal knowledge. فإتيانه بالحادث بعد ذلك تأكيد وإيضاح للمبتدئ. So his mentioning after that, originated, is simply for emphasis and clarification for the beginner. Right? And this is a point that he made earlier, which is that for beginners, one must clarify things. But part of the training of the student of knowledge as they study classical texts is to sharpen their capacity for precise thinking. Right? That he's saying that were you a thinking individual, if you hear the word, if you hear read the title, the types of knowledge or the categories of knowledge, from that you'd understand that what is meant is originated knowledge. Right? Okay. But this is not to put down, okay, you're just a beginner, but rather you would raise the person. This is to raise the person up, that keep striving. For those who want to write it down, on page 120, they quote the Mauritanian scholars, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, have a norm, right? Which is that they would memorize texts, but they gathered the key points that needed to be added to texts in what they call the ihmirar. is things they put in the margins in red. Right? So there are two things. Some they call them at-turra, right? Key marginal points, because in the marginal you have marginal details. But the key marginal points, sometimes they call them the turra, and sometimes they call them the ihmirar. And sometimes they distinguish between the two in red. And they made it a habit. Like if you had a text, like a primer, a matan. So amongst the texts that would be studied across the Muslim world is this Idah al-Mubham. But the Mauritanians have on it what's called the ihmirar, which is the red marginalia. And they used to write it in red, that these are the critical marginal notes. And sometimes the ihmirar would also be in verse form. And there are many famous ihmirars, right? They have the famous ihmirar on Alfiyat ibn Malik, sometimes the marginal note, and those are critical marginal notes. So one of the very useful ones here in the hashiyah, it's in 2 lines. Allama Abdul Salam al-Shinqiti, he on this thing that Allah's knowledge is not referred to as being nadari, nor daruri, nor tasawwuri, right? It's not acquired, right? Right? And you can see that. Okay. Then al-ilm, right? So this is sort of the method. It says the categories of originated knowledge. So he explains, wal-ilmu, what's the definition of knowledge? There are many rigorous definitions of knowledge. He says, al-ilmu ma'rifatul ma'lum. Knowledge is to know the knowable. Right? Ma'rifah is acquiring affirmation of the knowable. Right? And right? And here there's a beautiful work by Haji Khalifa called Kashfu al-Dhunun. And the commentary mentions that he mentions there 15 different definitions of knowledge. And inshallah, we'll find and share that just for those interested. Inshallah, the definitions of knowledge. Right? And there is, right? There are other definitions as well. Right? But we'll, if you want to look in the Book of Knowledge of Imam al-Ghazali, he mentions a number of definitions as well. We shared a definition just a few moments ago, for those who are awake. And then he says, ثُمَّ إِنَّهُ يَنْقَسِمُ إِلَى تَصَوُّرٍ وَإِلَى تَصْدِيقٍ وَكُلٌّ مِّنْهُمَا إِلَى ضَرُورِيٍّ وَإِلى نَظَرِيٍّ فَالْأَقْسَامُ أَرْبَعَةٌ. Right? So knowledge, and we're talking about originated knowledge here. Right? Right? We're talking about originated knowledge. So even this definition of knowledge that he gives is originated knowledge. Right? Because ma'rifah is to come to know. Right? So to come to know the knowable. Allah's knowledge is not kasbi, is not acquired. Which is why we don't say that Allah is arif. Because ma'rifah has a sense to come to know that which you did not know. وَعَلَّمَكَ مَا لَمْ تَكُنْ تَعْلَمْ. In that sense, he taught you what you did not know. Allah's knowledge is not acquired. Right? He knows eternally. Right? His knowledge, even of the originated, precedes its origination. And the theologians have discussed how that works. Because there's no before and after in eternity. Okay. So knowledge is tasawwur, conceiving individual things, and tasdeeq, confirming. And both of those are daruri or nadhari, intuitive or requiring reflection. Right? So he says, and here he gives us definitions of these terms. So he says, فَإِنْ كَانَ إدراك معنى مفرد فهو تصور. If it is affirming a singular meaning, it is تصور. Right? Now, you have to understand that this is a terminological definition of تصور. Right? Right? Because is coming to know a singular meaning. You're not affirming anything about that meaning. So if we say sharik, right? A partner, you're not affirming anything about it. This is just a singular meaning. So thinking about a singular concept is not shirk or not. Right? If you think of wine, you've not said anything about it. Now, thinking about drinking it, thinking about how good it probably is, whatever, that, then would there be a hukum related to it? Because, so تصور. كإدراك معنى زيد, such as thinking of the meaning زيد. وإن كان إدراك وقوع نسبة فهو تصديق. And if it's affirming the occurrence of a relationship between two matters, it is called confirmation, تصديق. كإدراك وقوع القيام في قولنا زيد قائم. وهذا معنى قوله إدراك مفرد إلى آخر البيت. Right? And if, and an example of that is to conceive of the occurrence of standing in our saying Zaydun qa'im. Zayd is standing. So if you conceive of the occurrence of that standing for Zayd, and you confirm you inwardly say yes to that, that is tasdeeq. And that's what those lines mean. Right? So he explains. Right? So he explains. Right? فزيد قائم اشتمل على تصورات أربعة. تصور الموضوع وهو زيد، وتصور المحمول وهو قائم، وتصور النسبة بينهما وهو تعلق المحمول بالموضوع، وتصور وقوعها. فالتصور الرابع يسمى تصديقا، والثلاثة قبله شروط له، وهذا مذهب الحكماء. Right? So when we say Zaydun qa'im, Zayd is standing. Right? And we accept that. We confirm that. That contains four tasawurat, four things that are conceived of. Right? The subject, namely Zayd, and what is affirmed for it. This is the mahmul. What is affirmed for it, which is qa'im, standing. And the relationship between them, which is the connection of the affirmed to the subject. Right? That's the relationship between A and B. Right? And the fourth, the fourth thing we conceive of is the affirmation of that relationship, or its negation. Right? And that fourth relationship is called confirmation. So you have A, you have B, you have the relationship between A and B, and then you have the affirmation of the occurrence of that relationship. That's called tasdeeq, confirmation. So there are four tasawurat, four things that are conceived of. The fourth one is the confirmation, the tasdeeq. Right? And the first three are conditions for it. In order to confirm a relationship between A and B, say A is B, you must conceive of A, B, relationship between A and B, and then the occurrence of that relationship or its non-occurrence. And this is the way of the philosophers, right? The hukama. And this is the madhab of the majority of the grammarians, of the logicians, right? And As-Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani strongly argued for this, right? That tasawwur, right? Confirmation, we say Zayd is standing, or you say there is no partner to God, right? That tasdeeq is a singular concept. It has conditions preceding it, right? And that's why tasdeeq is like a hukum. A is B, right? It's a singular concept. It has 3 conditions. Right? ومذهب الإمام أن التصديق هو التصورات الأربعة فيكون التصديق بسيطا على مذهب الحكماء المختار ومركبا على مذهب الإمام والمصنف ماشي رحمه الله تعالى ماش على مذهب الحكماء بتقدير مضاف في كلامه بين درك ونسبة وهو وقوع أي ودرك وقوع نسبة. Okay. So that's what we need to know. There are 4 steps. Right? That when you affirm A is B, you affirm A, B, relationship between A and B, and that relationship occurring or not occurring. That 4th one, when you affirm it, that is tasdeeq. That is to confirm. Right? You've said yes to it. And so tasdeeq, confirming something, is a singular concept. And that's the other 3 elements are conditions for that happening. The madhab of the Imam, and that's Imam Fakhr al-Din al-Razi. Right? And the ulama in different subjects have different terminologies for certain terms. Right? For certain scholars. So for example, if you say al-Qadi, right? In tafsir, it would generally refer to al-Qadi al-Baydawi. Now al-Qadi al-Baydawi, the author of the great tafsir al-Baydawi, Anwar al-Tanzil, he is a great theologian as well. But certainly amongst earlier works of theology, if you say al-Qadi in works of theology, it refers to Al-Qadi Abu Bakr al-Baqillani. And who is meant by Shaykh al-Islam? In most Islamic science, they say Shaykh al-Islam. Generally, Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari is meant. But in Hanafi fiqh, if you say Shaykh al-Islam, Shaykh al-Islam Khwaharzada is meant, for example. So these are terminologies, and that's part of training into. So, and how do we find out? You have to keep asking, who is meant by here? What is the usage, etc. And you have to keep asking that question. Here, Imam Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, one of the greatest of the Ash'ari theologians, is meant. Okay. So, tasdeeq, confirmation, according to the philosophers and the majority of the Islamic logicians, and supported by Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani, is basit. It's a singular concept. And composite, according to Imam Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, that it is all 4 matters. It's A plus B plus C plus D, right? Which is the subject what is affirmed for the subject, the relationship between the subject and what's affirmed for it, and confirming that relationship or not confirming it. All four, if found, constitute tasdeeq according to the Imam. And he has his arguments. It's a matter of subtlety, right? And the later logicians discuss it back and forth. The author is going on the way of the majority of the philosophers and logicians that tasdeeq, right, confirmation is a singular concept. And that requires considering that there is something implicit between two words in the poem. Darku nisbatin ay darku wuqu'i nisba. Right? Is conceiving of the relationship, meaning conceiving of the occurrence of the relationship. Okay. And here this is diagrammed by on page 124 by the author of the Hashia, and we'll be sharing these diagrams inshallah. And then he says that ثم إنك إذا أردت أن تكتب التصور والتصديق وتتعلمها أو تعلمهما فالمراد بالوضع ما اشتمل عليه فقدم التصور على التصديق لأنه مقدم عليه طبعا. That if you want to write these two terms, تصور and تصديق, then or to learn them or teach them, right? And wada in affirmation encompasses all that, writing it out, learning it, teaching it. Then consider, study, teach tasawwur first before tasdeeq, conceiving of singular concepts before confirmations, because they naturally come first. Because right? And it naturally comes first because that what comes second needs what comes first without it being a cause for it. Right? And they use the example of 1 and 2. Right? Right? And then فَيُقَدَّمْ وَضْعًا. So in affirming them, you mention them. You naturally mention the tasawwur first, then the tasdeeq, and that's obvious. Here, for those interested, page 126, and we'll share a diagram on this next class, inshallah. There are generally 5 obvious ways to order things. Right? Right? One is التقدم. Why mention one thing before another? One is بالطبع. This is the natural order. Second, لعلة. One is the direct cause of the other matter. Right? A third reason to mention one thing before the other is الزمان. One thing came first. So you're writing a book on history. You mention what happened during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ first, and you follow historical order. So it meant by time. Right? Someone asks, what happened today at work? You say, well, in the morning this happened, in the afternoon this happened, end of the day this happened. Fourth, right? Is, an obvious order, right? An obvious order, right? Like the fact you say, the Imam, the followers are behind him. It's an obvious order. It's a ma'loom order. And the first is due to rank, right? So who came today? Although in the morning you had, today a major investor came. And this is something notable, right? Or let's say one of the scholars visited your shop. You say, well, one of the scholars visited the shop, a group of righteous visited the shop, and then there's other things. But so these are different. This is one of the classifications of the reasons you'd mention something in order. Natural order, or due to causality, or time, or a known obvious order, or sharaf, or it being notable. Whether notable in virtue, rank, importance, significance, there's different types of sharaf. So these are 5, and you can find them in the Hashiyah on page 126. Okay. Then he says, ثم بين أن النظرية من كل من التصور والتصديق محتاجة للتأمل والضروري عكسه وهو ما لا يحتاج إلى ذلك فالأقسام 4. This is kind of obvious. You have the daruri, right? Which is that which, this is intuitively true, does not require reflection. And the nadari is which requires reflection. And that is also true. What generally is intuitive and requires reflection, or relative to a person may be intuitive or requiring reflection. Right? فالأقسام 4. So the categories are 4. Right? كما تقدم مثال التصور الضروري إدراك معنى اللفظ الواحد نصف الاثنين. An example of the tasawwur that is intuitively obvious is recognizing the meanings of the words in one is half of two. So conceiving of 1, half, 2, each of these is intuitively obvious tasawwur, each individual meanings of this. Right? ومثال التصور النظري, as for tasawwur, conceiving of something that requires reflection, إدراك معنى الواحد نصف سدس 12 is to conceive of the meaning of 1 is half of a sixth of 12. For most people, they have to think about, what am I talking about when I say all of this? Right? مثال التصور النظري مثال التصديق الضروري, the example of a confirmation that is intuitive, إدراك وقوع النسبة في قولنا الواحد نصف الاثنين. Right? A confirmation that's intuitive is to say 1 is half of 2. There's 1, there's 2, and there's the relationship that the nisbah is that 1 is half of the other. It doesn't require reflection. ومثال التصديق النظري إدراك وقوع النسبة في قولنا الواحد نصف سدس 12. But a conception, a tasdeeq, a confirmation that requires reflection, nazar, is the relationship between, affirming the relationship between saying 1 is half of a sixth of 12. For most people, you'd have to think a little bit about this. So then he tells us that وبما تقرر علم انحصار العلوم في التصورات والتصديقات. From what we've seen, that all knowledge goes into either singular concepts, which are تصورات, or affirmations, which are تصديقات. Right? And you can apply that to prayer. Right? Right? So if we say, or if you think about worship, they're singular concepts. And what do they require? They require definitions. We say salah, zakat, tahara, hajj. Right? These are singular concepts. How are they known? They're known by definitions. But if we say that حمل الجنازة فرض كفاية, right? Carrying the deceased is a communal obligation. You have to conceive of one part, what is حمل الجنازة and what is فرض كفاية. You have to conceive of A, you have to conceive of B, and affirming the relationship between the two or not affirming it. Right? Okay. وَلِكُلٍّ مِّنْهُمَا مَبَادٍ وَمَقَاصِدٍ. And each of these has foundations and outcomes. Right? So he says, فَمَبَادِئُ التصورات الكليات الخمس. Right? So in order, tasawwur requires definitions. But the building blocks for definitions are what's called the kulliyaat al-khams. Right? And we'll be coming to that, I think, next class. But the kulliyaat al-khams, because to define something, you need to understand how closely you talk about it. Right? Because you have the category of something, you have its essential attributes, close attributes, distant attributes. And from that, right, you have different levels of definitions. And the outcomes, those are the building blocks for definitions, the foundational building blocks of definitions. And the outcomes of tasawwurat is al-qawl al-sharih, is defining statements. وَمَبَادِئُ التَّصْدِيقَات, right? The foundations of tasdiqat, of confirming something, is al-qadaaya wa ahkamuha, or qadaaya, right? Are singular is statements and the rulings related to them. And the outcomes are al-qiyaas, are arguments, right? You can call it al-qiyaas biaqsamhi, the different types of arguments, right? Or proofs, right? Or proofs. فانحصر فن المنطق في هذه الأبواب الأربعة. So the science of mantiq is limited to these 4 chapters. 2 chapters related to tasawwurat, building blocks of how you conceive of singular things, and the outcomes of how you conceive of singular things, which is by defining them. And then the building blocks of sound arguments, which is each affirmation, and the outcomes, which is a soundly structured proof. So these are 4 chapters. But then there are other chapters, as we'll be seeing. أما مبحث الدلالات وأما بحث الدلالات ومباحث الألفاظ إنما ذكر في كتب المنطق لتوقف بحث الكليات الخمس عليه. Right? But then they also talk about indications. نسبة الألفاظ للمعاني ثلاثة. Right? The relationship between words and meanings are 3. And then they talk about what words are we talking about. Right? Why? Because words indicate things in different ways. Right? So for example, if someone's grandmother used to make them aloo tikya. So if when you hear aloo tikya, you think about your grandmother. Is there a relationship between aloo tikya, potato bread, right? Or potato stuffed bread, and your grandmother, right? That's an emotional relationship between the word and the meaning that occurs to you. But can we structure discussions around that kind of relationship? No, right? So that's why they discuss what kind of, because we define things with words. So what kind of usage of words are we talking about? إنما ذكر في كتب المنطق, these two investigations, how words indicate meanings and what type of indication of words, these are only mentioned in the science of logic. لتوقف مبحث الكليات الخمس عليه, because the building blocks of definitions, right, which are called the kulliyaat al-khams, and we'll come to their explanation shortly. Those are dependent on that, right? ومن نظر إلى أقسام القياس الخمسة عد الأبواب ثمانية. But those who look that there are 5 types of argument, of qiyas, of ways of structuring analogies, then they said the chapters of logic are 8. ومن عد معها مبحث الألفاظ مستقلا كانت الأبواب 9. And whoever counted the chapter on words separately from indications, counted the chapters to be 9. And why is he telling you all of this before starting? Because a smart person charts out the journey beforehand. There's 9 chapters in this book. There's only 4 topics. How are they 9 chapters? Or there's 7 chapters, or there's 8. There's different considerations. So he's sort of laying out the land a little bit. And these, what you have to do, we'll be sharing, Sidi Usman and I will be sharing diagrams related to these, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But if you want to do yourself a favor, like as we said, write out the matan, write out from the commentary the key definitions, right? And whatever explanations you want to put around it, you'll find that'll require writing out a lot of the text, because the text is very brief. But there's extra things you don't have to write out. One of the things a lot of the scholars say is if you write out the text, just write out just the critical definitions. Any explanations, put them in a different, in a different color or whatever, so that you have in front of you, clearly spaced out, visually, very clearly. Today we have, what is tasawwur? What is tasdeeq? What is daruri? What is nadari? That all stands very clearly. So it's very, that's all the other explanations. That's why you have the book. Like when you take notes, you don't throw away your book, right? The notes give you what you want to critically retain. Secondly, logic is all breaking things down logically. You can diagram the whole book. You can mind map all of mantiq, and that's a challenge, of course, right? That we can, if you want, we can mind map in one diagram all of mantiq. Are you up for that challenge? Of course, there's a principle in fiqh, which is لا يصح الرجوع عن الإقرار, that one cannot go back on one's admission. But you up for it? Of course, you guys can do it together, right? That, we will do a collaborative mind map of all of logic. Now if you do a collaborative mind map, you can break it into parts, and then you can just stick it all together, right? So we'll share that bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And then he gives some more terminology, right? So he tells us that ثم إن المناطق رحمهم الله اصطلحوا على تسمية اللفظ المفاد به معنى معنى مفرد بالقول الشارح كالحيوان الناطق في تعريف الإنسان المتوصل به إلى معنى مفرد وهو معنى الإنسان. So then the scholars of the science of logic, or called the manatiqa, right? They chose to name the word by which you understand a singular meaning with the expression al-qawl al-sharih, which mean, which mean basically the defining statement. Qawl here means statement, right? Al-qawl al-sharih, like when we say the rational animal in defining the human being. So when we say the rational animal, this leads one to a singular meaning, which is the human. And that's the meaning of وَهَذَا مَعْنَى قَوْلِهِ وَمَا بِهِ إِلَى تَصَوُّرٍ etc. Right? In the aforementioned lines. وَاصْطَلَحُوا على تسمية اللفظ المفيد للتصديق حجة. And terminologically they used the expression hujja, proof, for the word, for the expression that leads to a confirmation. Right? And this hujja is also called qiyaas, analogy. كالعالم متغير وكل متغير حادث المتوصل به إلى النتيجة وهي العالم حادث. وهذا معنى قوله وما لتصديق البيت. Right? So he says rahimahullah that, so they use the term proof or analogy for the expressions that result in confirmation, tasdeeq. Right? Expressions, why? Because there are two affirmations, and as we'll see that they have a shared middle from which a conclusion arises necessarily, such as al-alam mutaghayyir, the world is in the alam, everything existent, every originated existent is changing. And everything changes, so everything in creation is changing. And everything that changes is originated. So the shared meaning that is the result of that is that the world, al-alam, which can say the world or anything created, is originated. Al-alam, the world, right? And they define alam in a number of ways. That's what you could translate as the world, right? You could translate alam as the universe, right? Everything in existence, right? This is كل موجود سوى الله تعالى, every existent thing besides Allah. And that's what's meant by the final line of the aforementioned lines. Then he tells us about two further things, which are how words indicate meanings. That's lines 24 and 25. And he unpacks these lines to some level. And then he explains, and there's a lot of terminology here, and don't get lost in it. All you have to do, if you're able to diagram the terminology before you come to class, because it's very straightforward, it'll make the class that much easier. And it's one of the places where where the commentator has broken down things more than elsewhere, right? And then in lines 26 and 27, 28, 29, he just tells us something very obvious, that there's used words and non-used words, singular words and composite words. So those are 4 lines, but they're very obvious. But lines 24 and 25 need a little bit of unpacking. So we'll look at those next, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But the basic concept is very straightforward. Words indicate meanings in 3 ways. The relation between a word and a meaning, right, is either that A is B in that A equals B. And that's, what's that called? Mutabaqa, correspondence. Or you say A is B because B is part of A. And that's called tadammun. Right? So correspondence or or a partitive relationship, or A is B because B is entailed by A. And that's iltizam. And these relationships can be in various ways. Right? By word, by the meaning of the word, it can be in other ways. And we only want one relation. We're only concerned with, logic is concerned with words and the meanings indicated by the words as they're used. So there's no such thing as, well, things are as you define them. Because if things are as you define them, then civilization needs to stop. Right? Right? Because what is right, well, it depends. And what is wrong, it depends. Then it's basically an invitation to chaos. Because if right, what's mine? Well, it depends on what I consider mine. Because if everything depends, then I can just say, well, your money is my money. And you say, your money is my money. And then we just fight like animals, right? With civilization is only, the civilization only remains on the basis of shared meaning, right? Because otherwise you have some other problems. But so people took this quite seriously, right? The basis of being a civil person is the capacity to think straight. But otherwise, Imam Shafi'i said, I never debated an intelligent person except that I beat them. And I never debated a fool except that he overwhelmed me. Why? Because there's no basis for arguing with a fool. Right? Right? There's a street saying in English that never argue with a donkey. You waste your time and you annoy the donkey. Right? So you have to know, who to, right? Because there's no basis for discourse with someone who doesn't agree to principles, right? And that's why usually with logic, they also study a science called the ilmu adab al-bahth wal-munadhara, the science of research and debate. Because debate is not mudslinging, and debate is a very civilized act. Right? Debate is a very civilized act, if done correctly. Otherwise, might as well just take out the weapons and bludgeon each other to death. Right? It'd be more meaningful. At least there'll be an outcome. Someone will die. Right? فنسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى العافية. So we'll continue from here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions?
When the commentator describes the categories for at-tasawwur al-daruri and tasawwur al-nadari, he gives examples. If these are distinct categories, then how come the example is the same between two of them?
No, because in the first, he's talking about the word, and the second, he's talking about the meaning. notice there's a slight distinction between the tasawwur and the tasdeeq. Right? So the first he says, when he talks about, like in the tasawwur al-nadhari, he says, معنى اللفظ المفاد من الواحد نصف سدس الاثني عشر. So the word that's understood from that, it's a singular concept, right? اللفظ, what's the exact expression? Could you just read it? مثال.
إدراك معنى الواحد نصف سدس الاثني عشر.
That's التصور
النظري.
التصور النظري.
Yeah.
إدراك معنى, right? So conceiving of the meaning of this statement, right? Which is a singular thing, right? That one is, which is, what's the meaning? One. That's singular. But confirming this statement as true needs to conceive of. So what is the example for التصديق النظري? Right? Is to conceive of the occurrence of the relationship that one is half of a sixth of 12. Right? So this is, so the first is, is conceiving a singular meaning, which is one.
Yeah.
Right? The sum of all of this, if you put brackets around it, one is half of a sixth of 12. And what's in the brackets? One. Correct? So that's tasawwur, because it's a singular meaning. إدراك معنى مفرد, conceiving of a singular meaning. So you put that in brackets, it's one thing. But conceiving of the occurrence of the relationship between one is, right? So you have A, which is one, is one, and then in brackets, what is it? Half of a sixth of 12 in brackets. So A is B. That you need to think about. Right? Why? Because one doesn't require thinking. But A is half of this, you have to think about this. Right? Half of a sixth of 12, you have to think about it, is one. Right? So you conceive of A intuitively. One. B requires reflection. What is half of a sixth of 12? Then the relationship between the two, which is. And then you say, yeah, it is.
Going back to 2, so tasawwur nadhari, aren't we still implying an is? By saying that one is a half of a sixth of 12, is the is not still there?
No, but just conceiving of, but there it's like you're putting a bracket around the whole thing. That, because at the end, like basically, if you put a bracket around all of it, it's a singular meaning. You're saying one. Yeah. Right? Like if you think about it another way, let's talk about a balloon. Right? If we say the big red round squeaky balloon, is that tasawwur or tasdeeq? Tasawwur. Correct? You said something about it, but it's a balloon. Right? But then if you say the balloon is big, red, round, and squeaky, what is that? Tasdeeq. You have to conceive of balloon, then in square brackets you put big, round, red, squeaky. So you have A is B. So you make tasawwur of A, tasawwur of B, and the B is made up of different elements, whatever. And then you affirm is or is not. You say, yeah, it is. So you say yes. So that's tasdeeq. So he deliberately did this. It's an intriguing example that he used, but we can think of like the balloon example or there's other things like that. Right? Radiallahu ta'ala anhum. A lot of the building blocks of logic are just terminology. There's nothing particularly challenging about it, right? But to the extent that you can diagram it and stuff, and think about examples, come up with random examples, make them silly, make them fun, make them boring. You can apply this to fiqh, right? Some tasawwur is obvious, right? That's why sometimes they'll say, ma'roof, open a dictionary, right? Some dictionaries, Mukhtar al-Sihah, have you tried using it? I actually threw my copy of Mukhtar al-Sihah sometimes. In Damascus, I used to get very frustrated. Look up a term, in Damascus, I tried not to look up anything in English dictionaries. Our copy of Hans Wehr was in my wife's room. And when she'd be studying, she'd have her door closed. Right? I encouraged her to close the door just so I couldn't get to Hans Wehr. If you had a difficult dictionary, I'd force myself to look in Mukhtar al-Sihah, then al-Misbah al-Munir, then I got other dictionaries. Sorry, Mukhtar al-Sihah, it says ma'roof. I want to go Punjabi on them, use some colorful language. Like if I knew the word, why would I come to you to ask you what does it mean? Right? But you find that they define a term. And some terms are obvious. And what is that? They give you maddat al-tasawwur. A is B. And that is the ta'rif or the qawl al-sharih. And you can apply that in any science. What kind of definition is this? And you'll be intrigued. That in different sciences, they define things differently. You can apply that to the Ajrumiyya. And you'll see that a large percentage of the definitions of introductory level books are problematic, but deliberately so. As he tells us later in the text, وَعِنْدَنَا مِنْ جُمْلَةِ الْمَرْدُودِ أَنْ تُدْخَلَ أو أن تذكر الأحكام في الحدود. And according to scholars of logic, from what is not acceptable is that rulings be mentioned in definitions. Because the ruling of something is derivative from first conceiving of it. So if you say, what is the prayer? It's an obligatory act a Muslim does 5 times a day. If I don't know what the act is, then how can I talk about it being obligatory in its definition? Right? Because first you conceive of prayer, then you say prayer is obligatory. But then if I say a prayer is an obligatory act a Muslim must do, then if I say prayer is obligatory, so I say an obligatory act a Muslim must do is obligatory, would be absurd. But the ulama in many sciences ignore the rigor of things like that because it's just practical. So what is the definition of the fa'il in the Ajrumiyya? Huwa al-ismul You guys should know the al-fa'ilu huwa al-ismu al-marfu' al-madhkuru qablahu fi'luhu, correct? Or something like that. I swear I haven't reviewed the Ajrumiyya for ages. I've taught it, but I'm a lazy memorizer. The fa'il is al-ismu al-marfu'. Immediately, students of logic should have alarm bells. You can't do that, Imam Ibn Ajum, but he knows. But the simplest way of conceiving of something is, in some situations, is just tell the definition. It tells the ruling, right? But you can start seeing, then say, okay, why did they do that? The scholars of fiqh use very interesting ways of defining terms. Like what's a town? When they discuss Salat, Jumu'ah, for example. Right? And you notice that in different subjects, they have different aims. Right? In how they define things. Right? And certainly the scholars of fiqh, they would say that, male and female are considered two different genuses, two different categories, even though they're both human beings, but because the fuqaha don't look at the realities of things, right? So they're both subcategories of human. But when it comes to transaction, what you buy a cow for is different from what you buy a bull for. So they're considered different categories. Very interesting. Would support the idea of men are from where? Mars, and women are from Venus. Because the scholars of fiqh, their use of definitions is for different purposes. And you see that in different sciences. Whereas theologians, for example, at least arguably, but then if you take the building blocks of definitions, and then we are looking at this, or indirectly, at the definition of what is a prophet. And when they talk about the trustworthiness of prophets, right? Being able to conceive clearly of how terms are defined, then you can visualize very clearly that there's a lot that is implicit in how we conceive of what a prophet is. And we covered that in the Bajuri and the Sanusiya, for example. That's why logic is very beneficial. It helps. Okay, this is what they're saying. So what is it? This is what they're saying. But these are tools that if you were to apply them, you can think clearly. If you learn the tool, learn how to apply it, and do a little bit of practice on thinking. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى التيسير والعافية وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الحمد لله رب العالمين.